speaking is the number one fear above death. Luckily, I don't feel that way because I probably wouldn't be doing it. I actually do fear death more in this scenario. But I always thought it would be important for me to share my story, kind of give back to the community as someone with dwarfism. I grew up in a family where there's no history of dwarfism, but the world still needs to be educated about dwarfism. It took a while for me to figure out uh, that speaking was one of the paths that I wanted to take in my life. And it was about when I was 15, 16 years old, I had a major life event happen where I lost my ability to walk due to spinal cord compression. And I missed 29 days of school. And one of the things I needed to do while I was in school or while I was going through the surgery, was journal and write about my experiences, because that could then kind of make up for some of the schoolwork that I was missing. And from that point forward, I tried to do my best writing journal entries, sharing my experiences of how I was feeling in different stages of life. And unfortunately, that only lasted until a little after college. And then, life got busy and I stopped journaling, but tried to figure out ways to tell my story based on what I shared during those different experiences, and figuring out how I could make an impact in the professional environment, knowing that speaking is not something that you just start doing and make a ton of money off of. I wanted to kind of get my foot in the door working in the corporate entertainment environment before I started sharing my story, because in a lot of those entry level jobs, you're up against a lot of people who are at high levels, and they're usually the subject matter expert getting asked to speak places. So once people started asking me to share my story, I then found ways to practice as much as possible. In college, I helped found a Toastmasters club. If you look up Toastmasters, I'm not sure if many of you know about it, but maybe some of you do. It's a funny name for a public speaking organization, but they have them all over the world, chapters, where you can go through these different stages of speeches with different types of criteria, and the audience will critique you. There's someone who's in charge of counting your ums and ahs and so's, all the things that they call word crutches. And then they can also give you feedback on maybe how you can improve your speech in the future. So I went through it was like a 10-phase competent Toastmaster certification, and tried very hard to pause in the future as I was delivering speeches, collect my thoughts rather than using some of those crutch words. But my biggest thing is just getting as much practice as possible. So now I've spoken at over 300 different venues, virtual and in person. And it's figuring out, okay, is this worth doing it for no money? But maybe they'll be able to give me video content that I could use to pitch for future speeches. Is this really a waste of time, or is it me getting more experience? And of course, there are moments where travel expenses could cost a lot of money, and if they're not able to pay you, you're not sure if it's worth it. But it's figuring out what are those opportunities you can do, whether paid or unpaid, to get that experience and continue to hone in on the craft. Getting constructive feedback is a huge piece. I always try to get constructive feedback. Toastmasters has that built in, but not every scenario does. And there are speeches where I deliver and maybe I don't feel that great about it, but it's getting people to share how I can do better and taking that feedback and implementing it in future speeches. I struggle a lot with memorization. So if I write out a speech, it's hard for me to try to memorize it and deliver it with the same amount of energy that I have when speaking from the heart. For example, back in 2014, I delivered my first TEDx talk, and I had it all written out, and I didn't really spend enough time preparing, memorizing it. And I ended up cutting it short so I wouldn't seem extremely nervous as I was forgetting the rest of the content. So an up to 18-minute speech ended up being 8 minutes, and that still fit within the criteria, and it was still considered a TEDx. But I worry a lot about writing out my entire speeches. And that's why I try to put bullet points of things that I may want to cover, but it may just be what I'm thinking about that day and how I'm feeling. But I do pay attention to what a company or school may be asking for, the points that I want to make sure that I include as I'm going through my story. So when I did officially launch my speaking career and when I started getting paid for speaking, it was at a time where I didn't think I was at a point in my life where people wanted to listen to me. I had had a few years in the working environment and I was just an assistant. I didn't think people would want to hear my story. But then once I started sharing my story, people were interested. And I found my niche within the school environment where there's a child with a physical difference transitioning from elementary to middle school, getting to know a whole new group of people once they get to that new school. And that whole new group of people could have a few potential bullies mixed in. But if I go in, share my story of growing up and my experiences I had, I then allow people to ask me the questions. So then hopefully that can help ease any potential intimidation that child may be feeling. And I do try to always make sure that there's time for question and answers because that can help dictate the direction of the rest of the speech. And I truly believe that no question is offensive. I want people to ask questions rather than make assumptions. And my favorite speeches that I've delivered have been when there are people that are, not that it's good behavior, but when there are people that are pointing and staring and laughing at the beginning of the presentation, and then they're speechless at the end, because that really proves that there was some type of impact, and hopefully that will change their behaviors in the future. So it's really important for anyone to try to figure out how to tell their story. Online platforms are a great place to start. So before I even delivered regular speeches in person, I built out a blog, kind of building off of those journal entries from earlier. And then I started a Twitter and a Facebook. I also found ways to just keep my finger on the pulse when it came to news about disability inclusion. So if I would find articles that show people doing things that maybe others may think are impossible, I try to profile those through the storytelling of my public speaking. And it is really just, it doesn't have to be like you always deliver a really long, hour-long speech. It could be 2 minutes, just finding ways to build off of that, of delivering your story to whichever audience you want to try to reach. And if you don't think you have a story to tell, it's a lie, because everyone has a story to tell, and it just takes practice. And I recommend trying to speak from the heart as best you can, so then it doesn't add to the nervousness as you're trying to remember the content that you want to deliver.
It's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And
Of
you know, I
course.
think that everybody here in our group too, we have faced some challenges ourselves, you know, obviously individually and separately. And as a community, when we practice these on a weekly basis, we get to learn a little bit more and different little pieces of everybody. So it's been a very interesting journey. And you sharing that with us is very powerful. I want to open the room for the ladies. If ladies, you guys have any questions for Becky in regards to her journey. I think Vanessa, you have one. Vanessa, did you want to ask your own question?
Sure. Hi, thank you for being
Hi,
here.
of course.
I wanted to ask, do you follow a specific chronological order when you're delivering your story, or do you choose like one story and this is the story I'm going to share today, kind of thing?
Yeah, I try to go through kind of the cycle of events, chronological order, but I kind of get a gauge on the time and figure out, like, do I have a lot of time to go through? How detailed will I go? I also think about the audience. So when I'm speaking to a younger audience, I won't integrate as much about my medical complications that I faced growing up because it's kind of over their head anyways. But then maybe an older high school, college audience, that information may be applicable because it kind of applies to the perseverance that goes with the rest of my story in my adult life. There's one piece of my story that I try not to forget, and that was the transition from college to the job market. I ended up sending out 1,000 resumes, went on 100 interviews. Every time I walked in the door, I was judged based on my appearance. And I think that's important because people don't realize how much rejection someone faces as a person with a physical difference. If nobody has seen anyone like me in the past, it's going to impact their behaviors, how they react to me. So that one I try to include as much as possible. And then I probably don't integrate as much about my personal life as an adult, and that is going to just take time to integrate. So for the past year, I've been married to another person with dwarfism, and I think you just kind of get caught in the motion and you don't think of it as an aspect of the story because you're just like, oh, people are married, people have families. But I think that's a piece that maybe I could get better at telling, since it is something that people do ask about when I get to the question and answers. Some of the big questions that people ask are like, where do I find my clothes? Do I drive? And those I usually wait until they ask me because they come up so much. But if there isn't time for question and answers, I'll try to address those as I'm talking.
I love it. Thank you so much for answering that, Becky. We have another question here from Stephanie. I think it's a really good one. Stephanie, did you want to ask that one yourself?
Oh, yeah, sure. So my question for you, ma'am, is the making fun of yourself a good tactic to add to your speech in order to break the ice? So like if you already know like the awkward questions are kind of coming, saying like a witty joke or something like that right in the beginning to just kind of get it out the way to kind of, ease the laughs and all of that.
Yeah, usually at the beginning of my speech, I try to integrate as much as I can, probably just depending on the audience and how I think they'll react. But both my parents are average height, meaning they don't have dwarfism, and my sister is 3.5 years older and she's average height. And my parents always joked that my dad wanted 2 kids, and my mom wanted 1, so they settled at 1.5. And I do get people to laugh. I think sometimes people think, do I have permission to laugh? And I have to then give them permission to laugh. But the whole point of telling that is that my family helped build an environment where I could have a sense of humor, so I wouldn't be as scared when there would be comments from the outside world. So I think adding humor is really important. I've also tried to do comedy, and I find it really hard because you have to have like those perfect punchlines. So it's better when it can just organically fit into your speech without even meaning for it to happen. And then that question just kind of made me think. Someone did ask me once, do you sometimes react based on how you think other people are going to react to your difference? So I think it's like sometimes we're so guilty of being so hard on ourselves, it affects us from having a good time, or it prevents us from having a good time and really engaging with people in a playful way where you can have a sense of humor and joke back and forth. So I think it kind of just depends on the previous experience that maybe I had that day, and if I feel like having a sense of humor, but it definitely helps with using a joke to break the ice.
I love that. That's such a good way. The other thing I would add to the ladies, do you guys have any more questions? Megan?
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. It's amazing to have you here. I feel very I loved your story and your little speech that you did. So you were talking at the beginning when you talked about helpful criticism. So do you think you're hard on yourself when you record yourself? Like when you look at the videos, you're like, I should have said that or this and that, but everybody's like, you did so good. So do you feel like you're hard on yourself when you do your own?
Of course. And that's why sometimes I just don't even watch them. If people tell me they were good, I'm like, okay. It's hard. That's a great question. And that's why it's hard to get feedback when I want it, because I may have been too hard on myself, and people may say that it's okay. I would say the best way for me to receive feedback is reflecting on what happened, maybe some things that could have gone better, and then having a dialogue on how to improve it in the future, but not have it feel like, oh, you did this, that, and the other thing wrong, and you have no way of improving on that.
Mm-hmm.
And that took time for me to build those types of relationships where I'm able to get that from some people. But it is a nice way to just have an open dialogue rather than anyone feeling offended.
All right.
Beautiful. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for sharing that, Becky. And then we have another question for Delaney. Delaney, do you want to ask yourself?
Sorry. All right, so this is, I did Toastmasters, so this is regarding the feedback with Toastmasters, from Toastmasters about, zooming into a part of your story and having people go there with you, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, so many things influence our journey and the desire to do what we do, the public speaking. How do you choose what to zoom in, what specific event to zoom into, and get to your audience hearts?
Yeah, I would say the way you brought that up, I think that's something that I can always improve on and just go deeper into those stories, because sometimes it's that high level description of an experience and maybe people start to go there with you and then you bring them onto a different path. So it is definitely something that I think I can improve on. But I would say that interview experience, if I add some animation of like walking into the room and people being fearful of my presence, shaking, telling me I'm cute, asking me how I got to the interview, all before we get to the questions, going into that type of detail, I think can help bring them there a little bit more.
Thank you.
And then I do try to loop it back to like the work that I do is important to me, because I want to think about like when a parent is at the hospital finding out that their child has any type of disability. That's a pivotal moment in their life. Like they either decide that they're going to be resentful, they may put their child up for adoption, or they may choose to raise their child in the best way possible, even if they don't have the answers. And all that we do to influence portrayals, especially when it comes to the media, affects those decisions, because if that's all they've seen, it could affect them in a negative way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And this is a personal question for me, Becky, only because, as of recently, I've gotten a lot more into public speaking. And one of the things that I share is definitely my journey with mental health. How do you combat the emotional factors as you're delivering your message? Because I know that sometimes when you are delivering your message, there's certain aspects of, the emotional journey that just gets to you as you're talking. So what are some techniques or ways that you kind of sway around to be able to bring yourself back to continuing with your speech?
That's a great question. I would say give yourself permission to go there, because people want to see that vulnerability and they'll go there with you. But if you do feel that maybe it's getting to be extreme, like you're getting to that point where you're like, if I don't change the topic, like I need to leave this room, I would just try to pivot to maybe a more positive experience, kind of take them on that roller coaster, kind of what you learned from that experience and how it made you stronger, if it did. Just taking whatever storytelling technique, but find a way to have something to follow it up with that's positive, like what you could learn from it. And doesn't mean that you still can't be emotional about it.
Thank you. I'm definitely going to try that for sure. Does anybody else have any questions, ladies?
I'll let Elisa go and then I'll go.
Thank you again, Becky, for joining us. You have an absolutely amazing story, and thank you for sharing it with us. I deal with a lot of kids who have Down syndrome, and they are the most beautiful kids ever. And you do hear a lot about some of the things that they incur, them and their parents, with individuals who have physical differences. And I heard when you were talking, you said you found your niche in the demographic of, I believe, high school to college or middle school to high school, with dealing with something that's so well needed and something that a lot of individuals deal with, both the kids, the parents, the students, people at work, how do you horn in on your niche and what you want to speak to and speak passionately about?
That's a great question. So with the work that I do, in addition to my speaking, complements my speaking, because I speak on behalf of the organization that I work for, we try to use disability in the broadest sense possible. So we are kind of all encompassing, but we know that you need to meet the needs of different people at different times. And I think when I was finding my niche in the schools, it's a lot easier for me to speak on behalf of someone with a physical disability versus someone with a cognitive disability. One of the things that I struggle with as a person of short stature is that people assume because of my stature that I'm a child. So then people may communicate with us in a way that maybe they don't think we have the same intellect as other folks. And totally, there's a lot that needs to be done when it comes to advocating on behalf of different types of communities, but I try to be as specific as possible to my own personal experience, also knowing and letting people know that I'm still talking about one experience. So I think it's like trying to be clear up front, and others who look exactly like me or have the same lived experience or look like they have the same lived experience may have a totally different opinion. And I use that often when it comes to terminology. Some people may prefer certain terminology and others may not because of maybe a negative experience they had. It's like kind of all that connects you to the experience. So I would say that I found my niche by talking to parents of children like me who were talking about their children struggling in the schools. And then I just kind of built off of that, because if I stay as specific, I know I speak about dwarfism a lot because that is the medical terminology for what I have. I knew that if I stayed within dwarfism, it's such a small population, I needed to find a larger population of the disability community because it would have the potential to reach more people. And then that's kind of how I identify as someone with a physical difference within the disability community. But I would say it's not always that that's the case, that I'm advocating on behalf of one single person. I prefer to speak to audiences who don't think they need it, disability awareness education, because they can learn something, and my lived experience, regardless of my physical difference, can teach people, like, you should go after what you're passionate about, find a way to make it happen, even if it's not going to bring home all the money you expected. If you have that passion, you can go after it. Don't let people tell you that you can't. I had a girl in one school that I spoke at. She didn't have a disability, but she told me that she always wanted to be a teacher, and her father told her that the teaching market's too competitive and she shouldn't try to pursue being a teacher. She was in 6th grade. So like, why is her father shooting her down, like telling her she can't be a teacher? And I told her, you better go for it. If that's what you want to do, we will always need teachers. And I think it's like that limited thinking that people have. So I kind of am all over the place because I try to be a broader than what the niche that aligns the most with my passions and why I do this work, because of just the need to be flexible and be available if other people want me to deliver on other requests. So I think it's making sure you have those things that you can do really well, but be open to other opportunities if they come.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Becky. And that sets me up so well for my question. I just want to say that, you know, I really admire your courage and the way that you know, like, I feel like a lot of times we struggle with self-consciousness, just in a general belief, and we struggle a lot about finding our voice. And I really admire that about you. And I just want to say, ask, how did you find your courage, right? Like, what is it, like, what drove you to find your courage, and how did you find that courage to be the person, the public speaker that you are today?
It wasn't easy. It really was. So when I had my first, so I dabbled into speaking earlier in my life, but really it started after I was pushed out of a job, and it didn't end the way that I wanted it to end. And I moved home to my parents' house after living independently for 6.5 years. Really was down in the dumps, figuring out like, what is my purpose? What am I doing? While I was at home, I found some essays from when I was in high school, and one said that I always wanted to be a part-time speaker. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but it was out in the universe. And my sister is a creative writing teacher at a middle school. She asked me to come speak to her students just because she always talks about me and wanted me to go meet them. And at first I thought that I was just going to go hang out with her students, and it would feel like a waste of time because I was already actively looking for my next job opportunities without even knowing what I wanted to look for. And she just convinced me, come meet my students. And from that point forward, I just started using those opportunities as finding ways to tell and hone in on my story. And from that, I just continued to reach out to other organizations. But I would say that I didn't have strong courage when I was first trying. I was just kind of winging it, giving it my best shot. And the more I did it, the stronger I felt about it, and the stronger I felt about the need to continue doing it. And it wasn't as great to think that those early stages, I didn't have the courage, but I just figured out it's kind of that fake it till you make it.
I love
And
that.
it resonating with people. And I think I'm fearful right now of going back to a live audience because I've done virtual since March, but I know I can do it, but it's almost going to feel like starting over again.
That's a good point. Thank you, Becky. And I know we're at time, and I want to be mindful of your time too, but I just want to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Like, this has been so helpful for all of us, inspiring, empowering. So thank you for your time today, and thank you for spending this
Feel free to
30
reach
minutes with
out.
us.
Happy to provide any additional advice and practice giving advice on speaking and all of that. You get so focused. I get so focused on the storytelling. I'm like, oh, the practical skills of how I did it. It's helpful for me too.
Yes, definitely. And can I just take a picture? We're recording, but I just want to take a picture with everyone.
Let's do it, girls. Show your faces. Picture time.
1, 2, 3, go. There we go. Thank you. Thanks so much, Becky, and thanks all of you ladies.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Becky, for joining us. I'll definitely reach out.
Yes, please. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, ladies. Have a good night.
You too.
See you next week, ladies. Have a good night.
Good night.
Da-na-na-na.